A very warm welcome to everybody. Warm being the operative word this evening, as the sun is actually still shining. So a remarkable occasion this summer. Tonight's event is really quite special for many, many reasons. First of all, we're trying an experiment. We're going to speak from three different locations. John and I at the gallery, in the presence of a distinguished art historian, Francis Spalding, who we're delighted to welcome. Dr. Toby Simpson, who's the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library in Russell Square in London, which, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the centre of scholarship for that particular dark period in history in this country. And of course, Sarah McDougall, our wonderful director of arts and culture and all great things to do with the visual arts, who's going to actually curated this wonderful exhibition, and both exhibitions in terms of the brush with evil with the Holocaust representation by Peter Hausen before this one. So it's a special event because we're still in the middle of this ghastly war in the Ukraine. Every day there are more atrocities, and there are two issues that spring to mind for, frankly, every common sense thinking person. One is, how on earth is this going to end? And then two, the repercussions afterwards. How are people going to be brought to justice? 80 years ago, it was done through the Nuremberg trials with the British, the French, and the Americans. But now, who knows? Who knows how that's going to evolve? But I think perhaps we can learn lessons from the Nuremberg trials. And the subject of this evening's conversation was about the importance of library, the importance of archive, the importance of research, and the importance of art in terms of making the past alive again, making it relevant, making it engaging with today's, particularly today's contemporary society. It's a huge challenge that all responsible societies face. But I think in a funny sort of way that the Nuremberg trials is a great example of achieving all that. And there's been so many books written about it, but the standard book is, funnily enough, I think probably one of the first. The book by John and Anne Tusser, which I will show you here. It's still this huge book of, I don't know, 600 pages, something like that. It is still the standard issue. When people talk about the Nuremberg trials and the scholarship, this is a book that they first turn to. So John is here representing, obviously, his late wife Anne and her tremendous work on this book. Toby, Dr. Simpson, is here because by sheer chance, I was honored to be at their 90th anniversary. I think it's the 90th anniversary, am I correct? Their 90th anniversary celebrations a couple of months ago, no more. And I happened to see a text information board, completely separate to their celebrations, that talked about the importance of the Wiener Library at the Nuremberg trials. And my eyes nearly popped out of my head, and I immediately went to Toby and I said, I didn't know anything about this. And he said, yes, absolutely. We were absolutely pivotal to all this in terms of providing the archival information, which may only have been 15 years old, but nonetheless, it was pivotal. I said, please talk to us, which he's very generously agreed to do. And Sarah, of course, who is one of the great doyens of information on this whole period of immigrant art and the work around the Holocaust and the Second World War, and who, of course, we're very privileged to have as our key academic member of staff. So it's a great lineup, and I want to start off, if I may, John, with you, and I wonder whether you would just talk for a few minutes how this whole thing started.
The whole thing started slightly by accident, in the sense that I and a colleague did some radio programs about the Nuremberg trial. A publisher then said, wouldn't you like to write a book? And we said, yes, assuming that we had done a substantial part of the work. We clearly hadn't. And then when it was apparent that we'd only done maybe 3 or 4% of the work, there was no way that I and my colleague, who were busy freelancers, were actually going to write the book. And my wife, Anne, who had then stopped teaching, said, well, why don't I do the research for you? And she started that, and then she ended up writing the book. But the first thing she did, and that was how it began. The first thing she did was she read the 21 volumes of the trial transcript. I don't think anybody else has readily done that since. And that gave an absolutely core narrative base. And after all, a trial has its own dynamic. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you can't improve on that, and you don't have to. Then there are an enormous number of other pieces of documentation, all the UK government documents, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, down to the Public Record Office in Kew, the Lord Chancellor's Department, things like minutes of the British prosecutors' meetings. There was a lot of material around, and I'm sure that that was my guess, and Toby will talk about this no doubt, is that it was in compiling the case in the United Kingdom that the British team delved very deeply into your holdings, Toby, but we'll come to that a bit later. There are American documents, the collections of the two American judges. Eyewitnesses, of course, played a part. They played a part because they needed to make the thing human. But nobody was ever convicted on the basis of the eyewitnesses, but they were an important part of the fabric of the trial. There are other things that were involved. We went to Nuremberg, of course. We saw the courtroom. It's much changed. I can't say there was a great deal of atmosphere there, but at least we could say that we stood in the courtroom. And then I think I said, why didn't we try to get into the jail? And I said, well, they won't let us in. It's a jail, for heaven's sake. I said, let's try. And we went there and we showed our passports and said, we are historians and would like to see the Nuremberg cells, in particular Goering's cell. Now, can you imagine wandering up to a British jail and asking something like that and being let in? And they checked the passports and said, yes, please come in and we'll show you around. So we actually stood in Goering's cell. It's impossible to describe what that was like, but we did. Just one bit more about documents. All the documents in the case, or an enormous number, came from the Nazi sources themselves. Although there was general instruction from Berlin for people to destroy documents, because they knew what the documents included, archivists are archivists, and they did not destroy the documents. And in fact, it was the senior Foreign Office archivist, the German one, after the war, found some Allied troops and said, look, I can show you where all the foreign ministry files are hidden. They were hidden in the Harz Mountains. In the end, there were 485 tons of them. They were moved from the Harz Mountains, which were going to be in the Soviet zone, and that didn't seem a good idea. They were moved to a place called Schloss Marburg, where they were processed, translated, and became part of the fabric of the case. They're also made available to the to the defense, of course. But this is the point. All the defendants were convicted, when they were convicted, on the basis of their documents. There was nothing fancy about it. It was all evidence. There's one very, very curious thing. The entire archive of the German Navy should have been destroyed. Again, there was an instruction from Berlin that they, of course, must be destroyed. But there was then another instruction from within the German government that they should not be destroyed. Who gave that instruction? Admiral Dönitz, the head of the Navy, who was on trial in Nuremberg. Why? Because these documents, I think, they went back to the foundation of the German Navy in the mid-19th century. And Dönitz, I think, didn't see why the entire history of the German Navy should be destroyed in this way. But basically, archivists are people who keep documents, they don't destroy them. And incidentally, one of the reasons that the Japanese tribunal, War Crimes Tribunal, didn't succeed was because most of the documents there had been destroyed. So the trial was based on evidence. The evidence was made available to both sides, and that is, I think, an absolutely key reason why the trial had the effect that it had. It was incidentally also seen as a profound educational event. People should know in Germany through the documents of the Nazi regime exactly what went on. Shall I leave it at that for the moment?
I think that's a wonderful intro. And really, the point you make about the fact that the convictions were based on evidence and the documentary evidence rather than the testimonies, I think is really very interesting, very telling.
Yeah.
Toby, would you give us a brief intro in terms of how Mr. Wiener and the library and the archives actually came to play such an important part? Welcome.
Thank you, David, and thank you so much for the invitation. So, as you mentioned, the Wiener Holocaust Library has recently celebrated its 90th anniversary, and it's the oldest archive on the subject of the Nazis in the world, actually, and it's the only one that's been going continuously. But I don't want to overstate the claim of the library to playing a big role in the documentation. It is true that the library played a pivotal role in the trials, but I don't want to create a false image that somehow the library supplied all of the documentation or even the large part, as John's quite rightly set out. What the evidence was extensive, and in fact, one of the images that sort of stayed with me when I was reading about the Nuremberg trials is the setup was very. It was a huge organizational process to bring these trials together, and a huge number of people were involved. I read that there were about 1,500 people who took lunch during the lunch breaks at the Nuremberg trials. And in fact, in Nuremberg, there was a library established specifically for the purpose of the trials. So a huge amount of documentation was amassed for the trials themselves. And it wasn't as though the Wiener Library's documentation was the basis for the trial. So I definitely don't want to overstate the claims. What is true, however, was that the library played a role at a key moment. And the trials had been in preparation for considerable time as a concept. And there's been some very good recent scholarship about the intense rivalry, I would say to a certain extent, conflict between the four Allied powers, especially between the Soviets and the Americans and the British, on sort of opposing sides in terms of coming at it from a very different directions, from a different idea of what the trial's objectives should be, whether it should be a foregone conclusion that the defendants should be convicted and executed, etc. The list goes on. There's been a recent book by a scholar called Francine Hirsch about the Soviets' role, which is very interesting. People might want to have a look at that, called Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg. My point is, though, that it was a difficult thing to stage these trials in general, and the library at an early stage was in London, and one of the crucial meetings that developed the trials and shaped the trials was the writing of the Charter in June 1945, when the four powers met in London. At that point, none of this machinery of the trials had been established, really. And so, being based in London, the library was in a great position to provide, especially the British, the British officials involved, with relevant information and documentation. Now, this was partly kind of relationships that had already been established. Alfred Wiener had fled Germany in 1933, first to Holland, but then came on to London in 1939 and had built up an astounding amount of material about the Nazi Party, which anyone who hasn't visited the Wiener Library, you should really come and see just the diversity, the richness, the depth of our collections. And one of the major strengths of the library's collections was evidence of Nazi ideology, propaganda, anti-Semitic legislation, violence against Jews in various ways since Kristallnacht onwards. So just one example, the library had collected 350 eyewitness accounts of Kristallnacht. Now, this was especially relevant because as the preparation for the trials developed, it became clear that one of the things that the prosecution wanted to show was essentially a conspiracy to wage aggressive war was the line along which the key line of the prosecution was going. And so some of the documentation for that, of course, required looking at the documents relating to the actions of Hitler or the other leading Nazis, but there was also a sort of bigger picture to paint about how the Nazis had created a kind of criminal conspiracy, was the way that it was framed by the Nuremberg prosecutors, a government which was, in a sense, unlike other governments, that had adopted a criminal approach to government and to foreign policy more particularly. And the kinds of material that the library had amassed by that stage, given that it had already spent 12 years closely tracking the actions of the Nazi party and government, were absolutely what was relevant to the prosecutors. And so what you can see in the library's archives now is correspondence between the British officials that were preparing the case for the Nuremberg trials and the library's experts who read German, who knew their way through the documents and could sort of provide, you can see that information was requested from the library. And it wasn't just that the library made the documents accessible, they actually pointed the British prosecution in the right direction to the key documents. And so, especially at that very early stage where the prosecution was being prepared, the library played an absolutely key role. Later on, as the trials began, the library's role changed and receded a little bit. So the ability of the British and the Americans to find the documents they needed improved with time. There was also a sort of more co-option of other assistants from elsewhere outside the library. And what happened was that the library's role, it didn't disappear, but they became more of a sort of a trusted source of information, and also they became an observer and recorder of the trials themselves. So Louis Bondy, who was Alfred Wiener's deputy, went over to the trials. Alfred Wiener didn't actually attend the trials himself, but his deputy Louis Bondy did, and Louis Bondy wrote a very interesting account of the trials, which I would say is very much worth reading. The library was also given a full copy of the transcripts of the trials as a thank you for its assistance in throughout the process of preparing the prosecution. So I think that shows that there was an appreciation that the library had played a key role, but I don't want to sort of make it seem like the library was the entire sort of library service for the Nuremberg trials as such.
Could I add something, a very interesting point that Toby has made about the conspiracy charge, which was count one. There were 4 indictments. Count one is the common plan or conspiracy. The people who loved this were the Americans. Americans always go for conspiracy. As you will note, the state of Georgia is going against Donald Trump using conspiracy charges. And A, this is something that American prosecutors like, and B, they felt that it gave them the opportunity actually to control most of the trial, because if there was a conspiracy, then they would have the choice to provide the best evidence. The Europeans, as you can imagine, and certainly the British, didn't like conspiracy at all, far more common law oriented, far more criminal law oriented. Well, the Russians didn't actually matter on this count. And it's significant that in the end, on count one, common plan or conspiracy, 8 were found guilty, but 14 out of the 22 were declared innocent. So it rumbled on. The Americans had it. Robert Jackson, the chief American prosecutor, this was how American prosecutors work, and everybody had to go along with it, but in the end it was not what brought the guilty verdicts. So it's a very interesting, I mean, it's one of the problems when you're merging 4 different, or at least 3 different kinds of legal system. There had to be a conspiracy charge. The Americans needed it. In the end, it was not decisive.
Fascinating. Can I ask you, Toby, if I may, you mentioned earlier in your presentation that each of the 4 governing bodies, if you like, in terms of countries, almost had their own agenda in terms of their own done deal, their foregone conclusions. Can you elaborate a little bit? I mean, who was looking at what?
Well, I think probably John is in a better position to answer this question than me, but I think it's clear that the Soviets were not particularly interested in any kind of separation between the prosecution and the judge who would pass the verdict. They wanted it all to be kind of wrapped up, and ideally, I think they probably would have wanted to be sort of a cut and shut, scripted case, much like the show trials that we're familiar with in the Soviet Union. Whereas I think of course, each of the powers kind of had their own agenda in a way, and in terms of the Western powers, I think John's right. From the British point of view, I think one of the concerns was about foreign policy to an extent. That the idea in British foreign policy was very long-standing about what you might call the German problem, the sort of problem of an overmighty Germany, which had caused 2 world wars, which had brought huge death, destruction, suffering to the world. And so I think the idea of really putting the war of aggression at the center for the British was part of that. And Britain, of course, also in a sense has a different, as you say, because of its different legal tradition, I think probably foresaw different dangers, risks, opportunities. And Hartley Shawcross, who was the chief prosecutor for the British, he, I think, had a greater appreciation, and you sort of get this sense from his memoirs anyway, that a greater appreciation for the power of the symbolism of the courtroom. I mean, I think probably Robert Jackson had some of that as well, but Robert Jackson famously kind of messed up his cross-examination of Goering. They both, Jackson and Shawcross, gave great final sort of summative speeches, which have both gone down in history. But I think probably there would both the sort of wider political context and the differing legal traditions shaped the approach to preparing the trials. Whether that was the case for the Soviet Union, for the British, the Americans, I must confess I don't know that much about the French case. And in general, I think John is probably best to answer this question.
No, you're absolutely right that there were these different views. And the Americans and Robert Jackson, they wanted the trial to shape international law in the future. They were conducting a trial, but they wanted an absolutely major message. It wasn't that the British didn't want that, but they were so instinctively committed to, here are crimes, here are accused, we will nail the crimes on the accused. It's the common law criminal tradition, which Hartley Shawcross came from, Maxwell Fyfe came from. And by the way, just at this stage, as far as the Russians are concerned, the Russians at the end wanted them all hanged. They weren't interested about the nuances of count 1, 2, or 3, or 4, or whatever. They said, hang them all. And Stalin had said, I think it was at Yalta, when they were originally discussing what should happen after the war, Stalin said, well, there should be a firing squad with perhaps 50,000 people killed. After they said, no, Stalin was having a little joke. But even Churchill, at one stage, said, when asked what was going to happen with the accused, he said, well, I'm sure that if a military unit comes across one of the accused, they won't find it very difficult to shoot them and leave them in the ditch. It is, incidentally, a crime to shoot a prisoner of war. So, part of the great debate beforehand was getting from saying just vengeance, shoot the lot, to Robert Jackson's great statement. It's 3 sentences. Can I read it?
Please.
He said that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. And I think absolutely everybody on the Western side could see that. And as a statement of principle, seems to me admirable at the time, even more admirable now.
I hear it, and I'm just trying to imagine any of today's politicians making such a statement and holding to it. I'm struggling on that one. Can I ask a different question before I bring Sarah in? I think it'd be very interesting for us to understand from both your perspectives and your expertise the actual structure of the trials from the point of view that you had 4 powers, you had 4 prosecutors with judges, this tremendous mix. How and who even actually managed to negotiate the process?
Again, this is better. John, you're going to be better on this one for sure.
Oh, I think the Americans, partly because of the conspiracy charge, were the leaders, and Jackson intended to keep it that way. This was an American show. But over time, the other powers, especially the British, said, look, you just can't use the best evidence. We've got to have something. And we know how to use it, but we can't just be left with dribs and drabs of stuff so that by the time we cross-examine, we'll be in danger of repeating what the Americans have already done, and the tribunal will tell us not to cover ground that has already been covered. So there was constant negotiation, and the British eked out, and sometimes more than that, important areas of cross-examination. And of course, when it came to the cross-examination of Goering, which, as Toby said, Robert Jackson failed badly over 3 days, and it was Maxwell Fyfe who just, as people said, he was a criminal silk at Winchester Assizes faced with a criminal who had the evidence, and he then drew the criminal into contradicting himself and lying. So there were constant debates about this, and the British in particular just worked very hard to make sure that they had things to present to the court which they were very good at presenting.
And each of the country's representatives had the opportunity to cross-examine and to interrogate.
Yes. And but again, one of the things the tribunal was very tough on was they said, we don't want to hear every country cross-examining over the same documents. Once one set of documents has been examined and put to a defendant, then you've got to find something else to say. Despite this, incidentally, the trial was felt to go on for a very, very long time. Amazingly, only 9 months. But there you are.
Well, I'm going to come back to the whole issue of timing, because you talked earlier on, both of you talked earlier on about the huge amount of preparatory work, and one can imagine, in 1,500 people, yet the trials were, within a year of the war ending. So
it's remarkable, I think, that how this effort was assembled so rapidly. I mean, there, of course, had been preparation long before the end of the war, but nevertheless, the one other thing that I think is worth maybe touching on, and perhaps we can expand on it later, is that I think today we have a perception of the Nuremberg trials being about the Holocaust. And I think that's a real misperception, because although the mass murder of Jews was dealt with quite extensively, and although images of the camps were shown, and there's actually archival footage, which I mentioned to you, David, of the reaction of the defendants to these horrific images. And although the concept of genocide was used, partly specifically due to the efforts of Raphael Lemkin to introduce the term, although all of those things are true, the main thrust of the trials was not to reckon with the Holocaust as such. And I think that, in a way, suggests that there are a number of misperceptions, I think, that have built up over time about what was happening, because this, as you suggest, David, this was a trial which took place very soon after the end of the Second World War. Europe was still a destroyed continent. There were still millions of displaced people. And in fact, even from the perspective of people Alfred Wiener was working with, of course, they cared deeply about exposing what the Holocaust, the mass murder of Jews, bringing people to justice. But they also were dealing with a situation where millions of people were searching for missing relatives, murdered parents, children, siblings, and just to bring that point home, another amazing archive that was assembled during the same period. It's now the Arolsen archives in Germany. This is a collection of 30 million documents, which was gathered from all of the concentration camps and ghettos across Germany back into Germany, and was managed by the four powers initially. And survivors from the camps began the painstaking work of going through, creating a tracing service so that people could find lost relatives. Now, it sort of might seem like I'm going a bit off course, but all I'm trying to illustrate is this was trials that were put together in the midst of a continent that had been completely ravaged, and where millions of people were still looking for lost and murdered, or to understand the fates of relatives who we now know were murdered.
It's fascinating. It's just the scape and the context and the speed and the thoroughness of all this is really quite remarkable.
It's about the rule of law which underpinned everything. And the Germans, the Nazis, they said they made agreements. They said they wouldn't go to war, they wouldn't attack people, and then they did. And you cannot have a world, as we are seeing now, where people make agreements, or say they make agreements, and then break them. So that was the overriding principle. And yes, everything else, if you can solve that, then you solve most of the other problems. But you're right, that was the overall framework. And then within it, this hideous story of everything that the Nazis had done from the Holocaust onwards.
Memory is key to a civilized society, because otherwise we can't possibly learn from the past if we don't actually tell the stories. And one of the great mediums of storytelling is the visual arts. And John and I are sitting in front of these two wonderful pictures, which for those of you who have not been to the exhibition, perhaps you can see now. But these are drawing number 1 and drawing number 2. They're the two major studies for Laura Knight's simply spellbinding painting of the Nuremberg trials, which is on permanent display at the Imperial War Museum. And they have all the characters here, and she used a little bit of artistic license in terms of moving people around, and that's okay. But of all the paintings that I've seen over the years, these particular images have an atmosphere of their own. They capture not just the presence of these individuals, but the atmosphere. Each individual has a different body movement, different positioning, and it allows you in. And that's what great art, of course, does, whatever the subject. It allows you in, it sucks you in, you want to explore it more. Sarah, tell us a little bit about the drawings, tell us a little bit about Laura Knight, and tell us a little bit about the circumstances, please.
Well, of course, Laura Knight arrived in the midst of this situation, which has been so well described by John and Toby. And, you know, we have to imagine what a task it was to actually capture that effectively. The commission came at her own request. Laura Knight was perhaps the most famous woman British artist at the time. She had made a reputation over many years. She'd actually been born into very modest circumstances in Nottinghamshire, and had her mother was an art teacher, and she herself began attending art school at the age of 14. So she was very precocious in that way, but in fact her talent sort of developed over some time. She met the man she would marry, Harold Knight. They painted in Newlyn in Cornwall, had to leave there during the First World War, and latterly settled in London, eventually in St John's Wood, in fact. She made her reputation really with works around the circus and the ballet. She travelled with the people. She really embedded herself, we would say now. And she always was very empathetic to her subjects. Of that type anyway. She'd also made a really big splash with a particular work she did in 1913, now in the National Portrait Gallery, which is a self-portrait with a nude model, a female nude model. And it was really important for her to claim that territory as a female artist. So obviously the famous male gaze, men had been painting the subject for a long time, and she was not afraid to show the woman as a real subject, and not just as an idealized form, and to put herself in the picture to show that she was painting it. So she was quite a force to be reckoned with. In the Second World War, she was one of very few women who were commissioned war artists. Only 13% of the commissioned war artists were women. And initially she was doing things like barrage balloons and that type of thing. She really became very famous during the Second World War as well for a particular work she did called Ruby Loftus Screwing a Beach Ring, which is a very technical operation. And Ruby Loftus was able to master this in 2 years. So she was something of a star, and she was asked, Laura Knight was asked to go in and make this painting of her. And what she did that was very remarkable was to show the operation in all its precision, and also Ruby as a dominant figure within that, but also she was still quite a glamorous figure. So she was able to sort of fulfill a whole brief there and to kind of please everyone with that commission. But really what she was able to do was to capture technical things with great precision and to show great accuracy and realism in her work. So when she was asked towards the end of the war to paint tanks and things like that, she declined that offer and said, what about sending her to Nuremberg? She really thought it should be recorded and that it was important to do that artistically. Now, she wasn't the only artist at the trials. The other artists there were all men, and included a number of Hitler emigres such as Joseph Otto Flatter. We have an example of his work in the gallery there. But what she also did was when she arrived was she very quickly took an important position for herself. So the men were all situated in the gallery, and therefore they had to view the proceedings through binoculars. And she instead went up to the American press box, and she actually took that over as her studio. So importantly, she was looking down on the defendants, and we get that aspect in the drawings that you see there. And despite, as one of the, I think it was Lord Justice Lawrence said to her that she nearly caused an international incident by taking over the press box. But it was a very effective thing to do artistically. And we can see, I mean, the detail of the pictures, you really need a closer view. But in the first one, we see, for example, Goering at the end of the picture in a distinctive grey suit. Perhaps David can point him out. He's furthest away from us in the first picture, and he wore that throughout the proceedings. Sorry, the other picture. And we also see that the defendants, most of them are wearing headphones. And of course, they were listening to the trial through simultaneous translation. So that's a really important detail that she recorded as well. She also kept a diary very meticulously, and she had a brilliant turn of phrase in the way she described all the different defendants. She described Goering as #1 prisoner and having, I sort of slightly paraphrase here, but a bull-headed, bull-like head and a misshapen face, and really dominating by sheer personality. And she did speculate as to what he could have done had that personality been a force for good instead of a force for evil. And her diary, which is in Nottinghamshire archives now, does really capture that atmosphere of the trial, what the defendants were like, what they looked like, and what their personalities were like. But also, she also socialized with the prosecutors, the British prosecutors, out of the courtroom, and she did make portraits of them as well. But she was really interested to capture that whole atmosphere of the war there. So in the final painting, she would include not just the very fine realism that we see here, but also an imaginative element to the picture, which was criticized by some at the time. But over the years, people have come to recognize how important that was for her. And it really was, in a way, the magnum opus of her career.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's mind-blowing to actually try to go, I want to go back to the scale, John. There's 1,500 people involved, and the time, how quickly such things were organized. I mean, okay, there was discussions before the end of the war, but they couldn't possibly have started to actually put the detailed planning into course. I mean, when you and Anne were doing your research, what came out in terms of this whole, the anticipatory part of it, the process and the planning?
Oh, I think what came out was that people worked terribly hard and they worked terribly fast. And there was a real sense of urgency about the need to deliver justice at the end of the war. And somehow nobody wasted their time. I think also, given that Germany was destroyed and that Nuremberg was the only halfway undestroyed city that you could have held the trial in, Nuremberg wasn't a very pleasant place for anybody to stay, and I think that was an element in it. They wanted to get the trial over, and there was something about the sense of urgency that the trial began in November, but by May already, only May, people were saying, "My God, this is going on such a long time. Why is everybody duplicating?" And indeed, the tribunal was increasingly good at saying, you mustn't go over old ground. And I think that also produced a sense of urgency and purpose. Nobody in Senate has ever suggested, and I think rightly so, that the defendants were shortchanged either in their counsel, the availability of documents, their ability to cross-examine, their ability to challenge cross-examination through documents. In other words, the practicalities of the trial were scrupulously fair, to the point, certainly the prosecution thought, of giving the defendants too much time. I think there was just a sense of urgency which is probably quite hard to recapture now, the sense of, after what we've been through, we cannot not take this absolutely seriously and bring it to whatever conclusion that conclusion is.
And I think it's also interesting to just give some thought to the fact that we imagine all these characters, all 22, were as guilty as hell, but they were not all found guilty, which is quite a remarkable feature.
Well, the saying goes, the shorthand was, we are looking for people who are close to the bodies. And the people who were hanged were undoubtedly close to the bodies. Whereas Schacht, the banker, nasty man, enabled the Nazi regime to work. He wasn't close to the bodies. Fritscher, the journalist, he wasn't. Von Papen, creepy man, but ditto. The only person, incidentally, who my wife Anne felt very strongly should have been hanged and wasn't, was Albert Speer, because Speer was in charge of the forced labor program. Zankel, a really revolting person, organized it and did the most appalling things. He was hanged. Speer, though, was the mastermind. But because people said, but Speer is quite a gentleman. A gentleman, for God's sake. And Gita Seregni, when Speer was in jail, she completely fell for him and wrote this book about, what a fine person Speer was. My wife Anne always said the one verdict they got wrong was Speer. He organized, the forced labor program was absolutely unbelievable. Speer made it possible.
Yes, I would agree with sort of that assessment of how the verdicts kind of reflect. We must reflect on them now, and in terms of evaluating the trials. I think another thing that was controversial at the time was whether Rudolf Hess really should have taken the stand, given that he was essentially mad. And I think that part of the danger of that and other moments like the Goering cross-examination was the wider perception. And there were, of course, many in Germany who were going to see this as victor's justice no matter what. But I think actually we can see with the distance of time that the power of the trials actually won through. And I think part of the reason for that was that there was such a mountain of evidence. And in fact, talking about people close to the bodies, the process of the trials did bring forth quite a lot of extraordinarily damning material, even in terms of the confessions of what the leading Nazis had done themselves. For example, Hans Frank and his involvement at Auschwitz, self-confessed involvement in mass murder, really. And so, although there were a number of missteps, Speer, Hess, Goering's cross-examination, I think on the whole, the charges stuck, and the evidence displayed was so compelling, perhaps partly because of its visual power. And we were just hearing about Laura Knight. I think actually the visual legacy of Nuremberg is in some senses what stuck. The image of the defendants in the dock sort of cowering and sort of, I don't know, it's difficult to describe exactly why these images have an impact, but I think they do. The showing of the images from the camps at the trial shocked not only the defendants, but everyone who saw that footage from the camps shocked people. So I think actually the visual legacy from the trials was very important. So I'm glad we've got an event here that sort of draws attention to that.
Absolutely. Sarah?
I was wondering about so I was just thinking about Laura Knight and her relationship, perhaps also to the German Jewish or other the refugee artists that were kind of involved in documenting not just the trials but the sort of wider experience of the Second World War, and whether she had looked at their work or engaged with their work.
I don't think so. I mean, she was really, as I said, there were other male artists at the trial, and that included, as well as Flatter, there was Topolsky. And in fact, on another wall, which viewers can't see, so it's unfair of me to describe it, but Topolsky also drew the defendants in the dock, and he drew them in a very linear fashion, and that work is in the Imperial War Museum. But he himself would create something he called the Topolsky Chronicles from 1953 into the 70s, I think. And he was one of the artists who had been into the camps at the liberation and made drawings which are very harrowing. And in the chronicle example that we have there, which is from 1960, the top of it is the depiction of the criminals in Nuremberg, and underneath it are kind of vignettes, if I can call them that, these harrowing scenes from the camp. And he made that in 1960 because he was worried about a Nazi revival in Germany. And if there's an opportunity for you both to comment on that, I'd be interested to know what you think the particularly caused him to be worried about it at that moment. But to answer the other part of your question, I think she was embedded in a particular style of working. She was known for this realism, and yet she knew she was doing something very brave when she introduced this. I think she referred to it as a sort of symbolic element. And so what she does in the final back painting is you have the two sets of the two rows of the defendants as we see in the drawings behind John and David. But the back of the courtroom, the wall appears to dissolve. And we see the city in ruins, we see the rubble, we see a fire. And also, when you look very closely, you see actually she's included piled up bodies there, just in a particular corner of the painting. It's quite hard to see them unless you look really, really closely. And she had been very struck from the minute she arrived of the destruction in Nuremberg, and the destruction also, to Germany, to the city, to the people. They were very impoverished. She met people who were starving. The maid in the hotel, her clothes were full of holes, all that sort of thing. So she wanted to bring that element into her painting, and that was how she chose to do it. But I don't know that she had looked at others. I think she was very absorbed in making the sketches initially, and initially she had thought she would go home and make the painting there, but she realized she had to be on the spot, and she actually was given eventually her own room there to work on that said "Do not disturb." And there are some photos in the exhibition where you see her at work with all her sketches spread around her, and it's so cold she has to wrap a carpet around her middle and tie it on with string. So it does give you the idea of how it was to create that work. But at the same time, because she was in this little box by herself, she likened it a bit to being at the theatre, to seeing a performance. And she said sometimes she had to remind herself it's not a performance, it's incredibly serious. But at the other hand, sometimes it was so harrowing that she would have to close the glass box just for a while to recover herself. So I think she must have been aware of those other artists, but she doesn't. I don't think she socialized with them particularly. She was really taken up. She was seen as a VIP, as a celebrity, and she was sort of taken out and entertained by the British side. So as far as I know, she wasn't mixing.
So I'm just thinking about what we know of Laura and I can't think of any artist that she was clearly sufficiently inspired by to sort of pseudo represent their style. I can't think of any towering figure in her early.
No, she was very confident in her own ability.
Yes,
but
very determined about what she was painting.
She talked about it being more like a Stanley Spencer, and I think what she meant by that was that really visionary element that she's included, which, as we've said, is so unusual for her. And of course, we don't think of her work as being like his, but just in that one element, I think that's really what she's referring to there. I mean, I think there were lots of artists she admired, clearly, but she had her own inimitable style, I think, by that period in her career. She was, I should have said earlier, she was the first woman since the founding of the Royal Academy to be given full membership in 1936. And I think she was the first woman artist to be made a dame. I think that was in the late 1920s. So, you know, she really was kind of at the top of her tree then. But in subsequent years, her work did suffer for a long time in that she wasn't seen as being modern enough. But I think people are now able to see, you know, modernism's not everything. There's room, and she did see herself as very modern, but just, you know, not engaging perhaps with sort of key European modernists.
I mean, I think it's a terribly daring painting. She does not paint the courtroom. And this is absolutely extraordinary. What does she do? She does the dock and then some of the prosecutor, and then sets it. And this surely is, you might say, a very, very daring thing. 1/3 of the painting is the destruction of Germany. But the other thing, it seems to me, yes, of course, there's a sense of the situation and occasion, but every single character is painted, as we can see from the sketches in particular, is painted in perfect detail. You recognize every single one. And what is she saying there? I think what she's saying is that there's evil everywhere, but each individual was responsible individually, and that is why it is such a great painting. I wonder, and that I don't want to start a hair running, whether this is the greatest political painting ever painted. I can't think of any others, so we can discuss that later.
We'll discuss that over dinner, but you're absolutely right.
You're absolutely right, John, and she was very concerned to show the consequences of a totalitarian regime. So that's what she was aiming at with that background. But there is lots of discussion around, you know, is it Nuremberg, the destroyed city? Is it the destroyed world? Is it the consequences of the Nazi regime, and so on? And I think, of course, it's all those things.
You see, I see something a little bit different in the painting. To me, what makes this painting so special is that each of these individuals, as we're looking at in these two rows, they could actually be members of parliament. They could be members of the House of Lords. They look perfectly reasonable gentlemen. They're all dressed, they all look very intelligent. They're all individually addressing something particular. But actually, it is literally a brush with evil. It's a huge brush of evil with evil. And I think that's, for me, is what makes me so engaged with it, that I can see an uncle, you know, I can see people who I almost know in these positionings, in these images, and yet actually, as a group of 22 people, they filled, I can't describe the quantum of evil that they had and that they inflicted on Europe and human beings. Mm-hmm. But that's part of really what we're trying to talk about this evening. Again, I repeat, it's how do we maintain memory? How do we tell stories? And what's really fascinating, and I go back to one of the points, John, that you made at the beginning, which I think is critical, that survivor testimony is incredibly important, but it is vulnerable to our human remembrance and our minor exaggerations and our emotions, if you like. But the documentary evidence is what actually secures conviction. And I think the Wiener Holocaust Library is so important from that point of view. I think the visual arts has got a tremendous part of that. It's a combination that allows interrogation. It allows comprehensive understanding of a situation. And I think that's what this exhibition has been trying to do, and I think successfully. And the world needs to continue to do it, because, you know, it's a whole separate debate, but in terms of the trials at The Hague and how long they go on for and how difficult it is. So it's regrettably, it is a fascinating subject. But we tonight have been absolutely privileged, John, for your reminiscences and your understanding of the situation, Toby, for your work at the Holocaust Vienna Library, Sarah, for your tremendous skill in curating. And I remember when we had somebody in the archives, in Dame Laura's Knight's archives in Nottingham, and the phone was ringing because they wouldn't do this and somebody else wouldn't do that and somebody had to authorize this. Nobody knows when they go around an exhibition the curatorial dilemmas that pop up in completely unexpected ways that have to be solved, because at the end of the day, what you see is the end result. So on the web, just one other thing, let me just see another. Yes, one other question. I seem to remember, but cannot see on the screen, that some of the defendants were in uniform, and I'm surprised that it was allowed. I'm not sure how, I think only 2 I could see on
there are a couple in uniform, but John can perhaps say more about what the thinking was.
Well, Jodl and Keitel, I think it would have been regarded, after all, they were serving officers, they were on trial as serving officers, and I think the view would have been that they should be standing, they should be seen still as serving officers. Interestingly, Dönitz is not wearing his naval uniform, but his legal counsel did. So I don't know. I think it may well have been that it would have seemed excessive to say you will not wear uniform. I mean, they were on trial for being soldiers.
Yes, yeah. You can see, I'm sorry, one of our friends feels that the resolutions on the Benue website and other websites with these images are not great. They are high resolution, the highest resolution images that we can. They're online. The exhibition itself will be online very quickly. Every Thursday for the next 2 weeks, there's a curatorial tour led by Sarah at noon, which you can please join us. Try not to miss this exhibition. It goes on till a week on Friday. And then I have to give 2 more plugs, if I may. On the 30th, we're again privileged that Dr. Strickland is going to talk about the Nuremberg trials and Laura Knight's involvement. She's an expert in this whole field, and that will be an evening not to be missed. And then on September the 13th, an exhibition which Sarah's been working on for, I'm going to say 3 years, but I suspect that's probably about right, and if not longer in terms of conceptual. An exhibition called Sheer Verve. It's the first museum survey of the Women's International Art Club, which was founded in Paris in 1898 and lasted very well through to 1976, I think, in London. 1976? No? 78. Sorry, I always get it. I use artistic license in my dates, always a few years wrong. But wonderful examples by Elizabeth Frink, Barbara Hepworth, Marlo Moss, Paula Rigo, Aileen Agar, Orvida Pissarro, amongst 30 artists. It's going to be a tower of a show, so please don't miss it. There will be a fully illustrated catalogue which we'll be publishing online with many great scholars writing on this, and it's timely, and for whatever reason it's not been done before, so Sarah's leading another Benuri first. So we wish you well, we wish you a wonderful summer. Come back on the 30th to join us again. Sarah, I thank you as always. Toby, thank you so much for not just this evening, but for the work and your team at the Vienna Holocaust Library. It's so important. John, as ever, a privilege, absolute privilege.
And may I say, if anybody has the opportunity and lives reasonably close, do come and see these sketches. They are so special. Congratulations to David for making them available. They are absolutely astonishing pieces of work. The masterpiece, of course, is the masterpiece, but these are revelatory. So congratulations.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good night. Thank you.